So the Kohanim had to wash their hands and feet every time they were going to go into the Ohel Moed, right? Well, we'll see that Rashi explains it's not that simple, and he teaches us a very interesting distinction between how Kohanim prepared to work in the courtyard around the Mizbeach and how they had to prepare in order to go into the Mishkan. There's a deep spiritual lesson in the two different ways or two different areas in which we serve Hashem that we can derive from this. So it all starts on the pasuk in our parasha, in pasuk Bevoyam Ohel Moed Yirchatzu Mayim V'lo Yamosu, that it says whenever they would come into the Ohel Moed, which is the internal structure of the Mishkan, they would have to wash their hands and feet, and then that would keep them alive. Or, separate example, or when they approach the Mizbech in order to serve, to bring the fiery offerings to Hashem. So that pasuk stellt sich Rashi auf der Wörter bevoyim el Ohel Moed. Rashi takes those words when they come into the Ohel Moed. Mefarish explains that what does it mean to come into the Ohel Moed? It means lahaktir shachrus avenu arboim ketoros. It means to bring the ketoros which happened every single morning and every single afternoon. Or it could also mean something far less common, that there were certain times where there were certain offerings that they had to sprinkle the blood of those offerings inside the Ohel Moed. Question is, what's bothering Rashi about this pasuk? What's difficult to understand about the pasuk that says when they come into the Ohel Moed they have to wash their hands and feet? Rashi has to explain where and when that is. So we're first going to look at how some of the Mefarshim offer an explanation. The Rebbe will not accept this as the full explanation. Mefarshim say, as Rashi come back, Rashi wants to address the following issue. As mezolni to meinen, we shouldn't read this pasuk that says bevoyam, that when they come into the Ohel Moed they have to first wash hands and feet, and think as the chiv misa is oichef habir rekonis. So we shouldn't think that if a person entered into the Ohel Moed stam without a particular purpose, and they hadn't washed their hands and feet, that would be a capital offense. In other words, if a person entered Ohel Moed without having first washed hands and feet, but doesn't participate in an avodah, so Rashi wants us to know that would not be a case where you have to worry about them dying. And the truth is that seems the simplest way to explain the pasuk. This is what would seem to be implied in the simple expression of the pasuk, bevoyam, when they enter, stam, without qualifying what they're entering for, el Ohel Moed, into the Ohel Moed, that's when they have to wash their hands and feet, etc. So neat, and that's different to how the description is for the Mizbech, where it says with the pasuk zok beferish. The pasuk says clearly begishtam leshoreis gomer, that they have to wash hands and feet before they come to serve. So that qualifies it, that they're approaching the Mizbech to serve, and in the Ohel Moed it leaves it open-ended. And because it's open-ended, that might seem to imply as the etzem bi'ala Ohel Moed, just simply entering the Ohel Moed, even if it's not while on duty. You would think that in order to enter Ohel Moed, regardless of the purpose, you'd have to, as a kohen, wash your hands and feet first. Therefore, say the Mefarshim, Zogt Rashi, as the Bevoyam Ohel Moed meant that no, that's not what the pasuk means. Rather, when the pasuk says you have to wash hands and feet before you enter the Ohel Moed, Rashi qualifies that specifically lahaktir chulei or lahazes chulei. Either because you're bringing ketoros or you're sprinkling the blood of these unique karbonos. The chiv misa is narvem and tutan avoda on rechitzas yadayim v'raglayim, and therefore Rashi is qualifying for us that it's only a capital offense to do avoda in the Ohel Moed without washing hands and feet first. That's how the Mefarshim explain it. Aber der pirush is tzarich iyun gadol, but we really need to understand if this satisfies the issue of what's bothering Rashi about the pasuk. Val for two primary reasons. Aleph, number one. Okay, let's say that Rashi is explaining to us that entering the Ohel Moed stam is not a capital offense if one hasn't washed hands and feet. Well, then that flips the question right around. Von wann nimmt Taker Rashi? Where indeed does Rashi understand al pi pshuto shel mikra, in the simplest understanding of the words, as mis nit chayav misa ifabir ekolis, that you are not chayav misa for just simply entering the Ohel Moed, which is heipech v'sis mashma fun pashtus l'shein hakosov kanal, because that actually seems to be the exact opposite of what the simple understanding of the pasuk says, as we've just quoted. That just entering, it doesn't say lishares to serve, it just says entering the Ohel Moed is already something that a person would have had to wash their hands and feet. So why would Rashi now give an explanation which is against the pshat? If you come from a perspective of the intricate halachic analysis of a pasuk, fine. In Len al Piderech Halachi is Das Sfara, you could give a rational explanation following the halachic path of Torah interpretation. As the word Lisharis, where you'll say the word Lisharis, which appears later in the pasuk and means to serve, actually is also to contextualize the first part of the pasuk. And the Pirush HaKosef is, in other words, the pasuk is saying, as davka bevoyam el oyel moed le shares, that if you enter the oyel moed, just like when you serve at the mizbech le shares to be part of the service, then is men chai berchitzas yadayim beraglaim, you have to wash hands and feet. So, okay, we could explain that that's maybe a way to interpret the pasuk, but that's not pshat. Ober. First of all, if that is what Rashi really believes, that the word Lesharis is the key to understanding under what circumstances you have to wash hands and feet before entering the Ohel Moed, then he should have included the word Lesharis as part of the Dibur HaMaschil. Bevoyam el Ohel Moed Lesharis. Von dem, was Rashi bringt, no die Werte bevoyam el Ohel Moed. Rashi doesn't do that. So instead, the headline of his Rashi commentary is just the words when you enter the Ohel Moed. And he doesn't even hint at the word Lesharis with an etc. Is muchach, that tells us, as blois von der Werte bevoyam el Ohel Moed allein, that just seeing just those words when they come into the Ohel Moed without any other information, veismen as the bevoyam is the hakter chulei, that already tells me that they're entering in order to serve either by bringing ketoros or sprinkling the blood of these unusual korbanos. But besides that, is in pshutoi shel mikra. If you want to understand the pasuk in its simplest form, which is Rashi's approach, it really is far-fetched to say that the pshat of the word Leshares later on in the context of the Mizbech is actually also referring back to the context of Ohel Moed. Because then the pasuk would have actually said it in a much neater way. Bevoyam el Ohel Moed, when they enter the Ohel Moed, Oy begishtam el Mizbech, or they approach the Mizbech, Leshares, to serve. Then they should make sure first to wash their hands and feet in order not to chas v'shalom. So it doesn't really seem to fit with Rashi's approach, which is the Pshat approach, to borrow the word Leshares to define for us when Bevoyam means, and that's how Rashi knows that it's specifically when you're coming to serve. So how does Rashi know that you only have to wash hands and feet if you're coming into Ohel Moed to serve? Bald as bevoyam el Ohel Moed verendigt sich mit die Werte yirche zu mayim velo yamusu. Consider now that the pasuk is effectively two major phrases. The first phrase is when they come into Ohel Moed, they need to wash their hands and feet in order not to die. And then you have a separate phrase after that. Alternatively, different scenario. When they approach the Mizbech in order to serve. Says Pshuto Shal Mikra Machiach, the simplest understanding of the Psukim would indicate as the word Lesharis batzitzich nit zu der friedige Werte bevoyam el Ohel Moed, that the word Lesharis belongs to the second independent phrase and is not referred back to it to define for us what bevoyam means. So how does Rashi know that entering Ohel Moed means to serve ketoros or the different bloods? That's question number one on the Mefarshim who want to try and give us an easy explanation of what Rashi's bothered by and how he explains it. Number two, base. Let's go with the thinking of the Mefarshim, which is that Rashi wants us to know that don't interpret Bevoyam to mean just ordinary entering the Ohel Moed needs to have, that you first wash your hands and feet, but it's specifically Avodah. If that's what Rashi wants to explain, he should have addressed it earlier. Where earlier? In Parshas Tetzaveh. Go back a parsha. Parshas Tetzaveh tells us that Aaron and the Kohanim have to wear the appropriate uniforms when there too the pasuk also gives two scenarios. Bevoyam el Ohel Moed, when they enter Ohel Moed, or when they approach the Mizbech to do the holy service. Now there too, Bevoyam, at a superficial reading, sounds like even if they come in not to serve. So why doesn't Rashi address it then? And tell us, Bevoyam Ohel Moed there also means for service. Yet in that case, Rashi does not say that the word b'voyam, to enter the Ohel Moed, means specifically to serve dafka v'netot an avodah. So why doesn't he address it the first time the issue of these two scenarios arises? Also, and it would really be quite a stretch to suggest, as the Baldor, as the pasuk nit mafsik tzvishim b'voyam aloyel moed un oy begishtam lemizbeach. You'll say, well, hang on a second. Over there in Tetzaveh, the Torah doesn't do such a strong separation between the two phrases, entering oyel moed and serving at the mizbeach. Is as a poshut as the leshois bakedesh besim akos batzitz choychof b'voyim aloyel moed, and therefore, in that case, it's really obvious that the word leshoris refers to both phrases, and so to enter oyel moed also means servants. Bees as Rashi has gone into my first, and Rashi doesn't even have to explain it. Look, that's a stretch. So really, Rashi should have addressed the question in Parshas Tetzaveh. He should have told us then that b'voyam is not bi'arei konis, but it's specifically leshoris. He doesn't. So that's another reason why it doesn't seem that Rashi's opinion is that b'voyam you might have misinterpreted to mean any time you enter the Ohel Moed, and it has to be explained. Okay, let's go further. Nochmer. Mekabachal nit zogen, you really can't argue, as Rashi is open to shelo zayin de kosal kadaitach, as bevoyim alo moed meint eich abire konis. After we've looked at the technical reasons why it doesn't appear as if Rashi's interpretation of the pasuk is to get away from a misunderstanding that bevoyim el ohel moed could have been interpreted as any time you walk into ohel moed. Besides that, it's actually really difficult logically to think that this is what Rashi wanted to come and explain. But Valin Derech Pshat is achidish godel b'yoseh zol zayin abire konis in ohel moed. Because let's think about it. It's how will you enter? This should have been the first question that crossed our minds as soon as we heard this. How would you ever enter into the Ohel Moed without a purpose? Which is completely impractical. Ben Chomash Mikra Veis, the young child who's learning Chomash already knows, as the Ohel Moed is a makam mekudush b'yoser, that Ohel Moed is a high priority area of holiness. And therefore, min geit nit ahin stamazo. You don't just walk in, to check it out. Das is kishmoi, as the name indicates. An ohel, it is a designated tent. Welche is a moye, designated. Men geht dort herein, bloß wenn der Eibishter bestimmt. You only enter under the circumstances that the Eibishter sets, when you can and how you can. On a haste dort hereingehen. And when the Eibishter tells you that you can go in, mit atachlis, with a purpose. Oif zuton di avoida. So it would be the most ridiculous suggestion that somebody, if you go into the Ohel Moed, not to serve, but you're okay if you don't wash your hands and feet beforehand, and you don't have to worry about dying. Well, why on earth would you go into the Ohel Moed? In fact, the halacha is clear. No person may enter the Ohel Moed casually. On the Rebbe Lenu Meforshim, which is why the Meforshim who now drill down into the suggestion that Rashi wanted to say, don't think you have to wash hands and feet before you go in for nothing. Then Meforshim say, well, it's not really for nothing. As Rashi might say, not for nothing in the colloquial sense that you actually just walk in and peer at the walls, but rather but when a person wants to go into Ohel Moed in order to bow and prostrate themselves in front of Hashem, which is permissible. Aber Leute in Derech Pshat is nicht mistaver to matter machen a knis lo moed lishtachvos. So that might be an halachic loophole, but in Pshat, the 5-year-old, the ordinary person who's reading the pasuk, in our minds, you don't enter the Ohel Moed unless it is with a very significant, mandated purpose. There is no specific mandate that says go into the Ohel Moed and prostrate yourself. And if you do want to prostrate yourself in Hashem's temple, it doesn't have to be inside the Ohel Moed. You can do that outdoors as well, as they did on Yom Kippur. So, in anybody's mind, you enter the Ohel Moed. Why? Because you're going to perform a service. So therefore, Rashi doesn't have to say, don't think that bevoyam means you're going in for nothing, because Rashi assumes that we all know that you don't enter the Ohel Moed for nothing, and therefore we all know that you enter the Ohel Moed for some kind of a service, Question is, why does he pick these specific services? And what was bothering him that he had to tell us these services? So to get to that, we're going to ask a question about the fact that Rashi's language seems to be very long-winded and really unnecessary. Because if Rashi, all he wanted to tell us was that when the Torah says over here, entering Ohel Moed, first wash your hands and feet before you enter Ohel Moed, is aknisa to ton, the avoida bifnim, means entering specifically in order to do avoida. Well, he could have said that really succinctly. Bevoyam el Ohel Moed, quote the words from the pasuk, say one word, leshares. That would solve it all. Now we know that the Torah is telling us you're required to wash your hands and feet before you enter the Ohel Moed for service. Why is Rashi going into so much detail? To bring Torahs in the morning and the evening. Or if you're sprinkling what do you call it? The Parakoin Mashiach or the Sir Chatos. This is not the place where Rashi has to get into the details of which services were performed in Ohel Moed. Now, Rashi will bring a dugmois from the avodas b'moed. Okay, let's even say, for whatever reason, Rashi wants to explain to us what used to happen inside the Ohel Moed, so you would have an idea of what kind of service a person would enter for. His nitmuvan still doesn't make sense. Firstly, Favos bring to di dugmois dafka. Why are these the examples? To bring Torahs or sprinkle blood. Why doesn't he use something which is much more common, at least more common than sprinkling the blood of those korbanos? That is putting the lechem haponim every Shabbos onto the shulchan. Or the atavas hadlakas haneris, or preparing and lighting the menorah. Or befratas eishtem because of fil frir fun lahakter chulei. Especially seeing as those are things we already know about long before we learn about Ketores. Number 2, nochmer. Die Dugmois von lahazos mit dem parakrin Mashiach osira avodah zara. The two examples, the latter examples that Rashi brings, which is the Parakoy Mashiach, extremely rare, or Sira Avodah Zarah, extremely rare. Besides the fact that they're rare, we haven't heard about them yet at this point in Chumash. As später lernt man wegen Parakoy Mashiach in Parshas Vayikra, and Sira Avodah Zarah in Parshas Shlach. We have a long way to go till we find out about these karbanas. So kommt Rashi mechadar sein do in unser Pasuk, as seinen do die Avodas. So you're telling me that Rashi wants to now, in this pasuk, preempt something we're going to learn much later on, so that we know these avodas exist, and then try and convince us that the pasuk now is referring to something that Torah hasn't yet introduced to us. Why would he do that? And number 3, Gimel, in the first example of Ketores, Rashi gets into quite a bit of detail. Lahakter shachris, uben arba'im. He could have just said lahakter, to bring Ketores. Why do we have to know when? Is Tomor, but Yosef, that's incredibly odd. Surely this is really not the place to tell us how frequently or how many times a day the Ketores is brought. Especially when you consider we've just learnt about the Ketores in the previous parasha and at the end of the previous parasha. As Ketores is pamayim b'chol yom, and there we learned that you bring Ketores twice a day. So all Rashi had to say is, you come into the Ohel Moed to bring Ketores. And we'll remember from last week's parasha, that's in the morning and in the afternoon. Put that all together, when you put together all of the details of what Rashi is saying and how much attention he's paying to what seems to be superficial to our issue, washing hands and feet before you go into the Ohel Moed, it all proves to us as Kavanas Rashi is neat to madgish zayin as bevoyam al Ohel Moed made the knisa l'sharis. That all shows us that Rashi's objective over here is not to prove to us that entering the Ohel Moed, as described in this pasuk, is specifically to serve rather than to go in just to bow or do something else. And it's not just that, and then Rashi is giving examples of what that looks like. Ketores is one of the things it looks like. Now, as it did from bevoyam al Ohel Moed chatzumayim gomer is dafka by the avodas. Rather, Rashi wants to tell you something, that when you wash hands and feet going into the Ohel Moed, and this is the clincher of what Rashi is telling us, You wash hands and feet going into Ohel Moed only for those avodas I've just told you about. Either you wash hands and feet before lighting keteris or offering keteris in the morning and in the afternoon. The only other time you'd wash hands and feet before going into the Ohel Moed would be for those unusual bloods, the Parakon Mashiach or the goats, the chatos of Avodah Zarah. In other words, we thought that Rashi was trying to tell us every time you go into the Ohel Moed, as long as it is for Avodah, you have to wash your hands and feet. It's exactly almost the opposite what Rashi is telling us. The only time, says Rashi, when you have to wash hands and feet going into Ohel Moed is either before Keteris morning and evening or before those two unusual korbanos. Now, why is that? The bir in them. So let's understand what Rashi is telling us. The shaila in pasuk was Rashi kumfern is what Rashi is coming to answer about our pasuk is not, the sound of the word bevoyam sounds generic. No, you need to know it's only when you're doing service that you have to wash hands and feet. That's not what Rashi is coming to explain. Rather, his question is, Favos tel the pasuk fananda ditz feinyonim. Why does the pasuk have these two independent phrases? Bevoyam eloyel moyed. Wash hands and feet when you go into Ohel Moed, or and wash hands and feet independently when you come to serve by the Mizbech. So Rashi is wondering, why is it that the Torah is separating both the requirement to wash hands and feet in the two cases, Ohel Moed or the Mizbech, and the warning of what happens if you don't wash hands and feet? Just say it all at once. Surely it's the same thing. You wash hands and feet before the Mizbech, before the Ohel Moed. Surely the pasuk could have just combined them, al derech v'yashteit beim din von Levisha's bigdei kehuna, like it did when it described that the Kohanim have to be in uniform when they either enter Ohel Moed or serve at the Mizbech. How did the pasuk there say it? Those clothes had to be on Aaron and his sons when they entered Ohel Moed, or when they approached the Mizbech to serve. Could have said the same thing here. Especially because then you could have used those words to serve and to bring a fire to Hashem. That could have described not only what you do at the Mizbech as it currently does, but it could have also described what you do in the Ohel Moed. So that's what bothers Rashi. Why is the Torah pulling apart two things that seem to really be under the same umbrella? Wash your hands and feet before avoida. Avoida means entering Ohel Moed or serving at the Mizbech. That's what pushes Rashi to say, Chelek zwischen dem Chiyuv Rechitza bevoyim el Ohel Moed und dem Chiyuv v'gishtan Mizbech l'shores gomer, that the Torah wants us to know there is a different type of obligation to wash hands and feet when we're talking about entering Ohel Moed compared to the obligation to wash hands and feet before serving at the Mizbech. What's the difference? The Rechitza v'gishtan Mizbech l'shores is adin in klolos hagisha. When the Torah describes that a kohen has to wash hands and feet before serving at the Mizbech, what it's telling us is washing hands and feet is a prerequisite to approach the Mizbech. And when you approach the Mizbech, that allows you the opportunity to serve Hashem and do the avodah. Therefore, seeing as the washing hands and feet is a prerequisite to approach the Mizbech, every time you approach the Mizbech, even multiple times a day, in order to serve, you have to wash hands and feet again, because the definition of washing hands and feet with regards to the Mizbech is it's a prerequisite to approaching the Mizbech. Doesn't matter how many times you approach the Mizbech. If you've left and you're approaching again, wash hands and feet. Whereas when it comes to washing hands and feet before entering Ohel Moed, is adin in the knisa. That is a prerequisite to enter the Ohel Moed. Even though, as we know, you're entering not stam to look at the walls or even to bow, you're entering in order to serve Hashem. But the washing hands and feet is a prerequisite to the entry, not a prerequisite to the service. At the Mizbech, it's a prerequisite to the service. So each time you reapproach for service, wash again. Here it's a prerequisite to the entry. Und als bevoyim es gewen Yericha zu kennen, dennoch sein kama avoida. So if you wash your hands and feet before you enter Oyel Moed, you could now do a whole series of avoidas under that one washing. As jeder avoida dort darf, the chiyuv rechitza is da is nicht adin in der avoida bei Oyel Moed. So, washing your hands and feet is not part of how you serve in the Oyel Moed. As jeder avoida dort darf aber besondere rechitza, which would then require you to wash your hands and feet before each unique thing. So, lechem aponim needs hands, and the Ketores needs hands and feet, and the menorah needs hands and feet. No. That's what the Torah says. Bevoyam, the definition of when you have to wash hands and feet with regards to the Oyel Moed is bevoyam, to get in. Once you're in, you could do multiple things and you're fine as long as you wash your hands and feet once. Why is that? So the Tama Chelek zwischen dem Din von Avishas Bigdei Kehuna. So why is there the distinction between wearing the Kohanim's garments, vusis derselbe chiyuv, v'hoyal aron goyim beida fallen, where it's exactly the same requirement to wear the Kohanim's garments if you are serving at the Mizbech or in Oyel Moed, as opposed to the Mechiv Rechitza, vusis abozunda sot chiyuv bayeden von die zwei fallen, whereas when it comes to washing hands and feet, we have just identified that there is a different set of rules if you're approaching the Mizbech or if you're going inside Oyel Moed. The reason for that is movement b'pashtus is actually quite simple to understand. Bigdei Kehuna seine ger zu der avoida gufa. Wearing the appropriate uniform is relevant to service in not only to service but to the specific avoida, the specific type of service that a kohen is doing at a particular time. Because the avoida muss getan werden sein, ungetan in die begodim. It doesn't matter which avoida you are doing. The Torah requires that as a kohen you have to wear the appropriate uniform to do that avoida, whichever avoida it is. Und der Rebbe is in dem nicht scheich zu mechalek sein zwischen Oyel Moed und Mizbech. So there would be no reason to distinguish. This kind of avoida has one obligation, that kind of avoida has a different obligation. There's an overarching requirement to wear the appropriate garments when you're doing avoida, regardless which avoida. There's a common denominator, to serve in Hashem's holy place, you have to wear these clothes. But washing hands and feet is not part of the avoida. It's a preparation before you do the avoida. A kohen has to purify and clean himself before he could begin the avoida. The clothing is part of doing the avoida. The washing hands and feet is prior to doing the avoida. Und der Pfarrer kann in dem sein Chilek. So then you could have in the prep for an avoida, it could be different depending on what avoida you're doing. And it's for very practical reasons. Just think for a moment what Oyel Moed looks like and what the Chotzer with the Mizbech looks like. If you're going into the Oyel Moed, it's a secluded environment. Nor far kehanim, it's off limits to anybody else besides kehanim. And you only go in and out of the Oyel Moed for very brief visits. Is genug the einzige. It makes sense. You wash your hands and feet once before you go in. Even if you're going to be doing multiple things, it's a very protected environment. The likelihood is that you won't contaminate your hands and feet. Whereas, by comparison, when the kohen is working at the Mizbeach, the Mizbeach is in Chatzar HaMishkan, that's outdoors, in the Chatzar. Which is not limited only to Kohanim. There's also Levim over there who have to sing, and there's the Israelim bringing the Karbonas, they're hands on, right? The owner of the Korban has to come right after the animal, put his hands on the animal. So that makes sense that you're constantly exposed. There's always the possibility of some level of contamination. So before the next avodah, you've got to wash your hands and feet again. So there's a logical distinction between how you prepare for Oyel Moed, which will be protected, and how you prepare for the Mizbeach, where you're constantly exposed and constantly have to re-prepare. With that in mind, verstandig de Loshen from Pirush Rashi, that explains why Rashi used what we thought was a long-winded way of explaining things. Where he says, B'voyim al Oyel Moed means lahaktir shachris or bein ha'arbaim k'toros. It's to bring k'toros, and then he specifies in the morning and in the afternoon information we already know. Why does Rashi do that? Because he's telling us it's a timing thing, not an avoida thing. Come on, Rashi's kipashtus l'shoinai. Rashi's intention is expressed in his words. The chiyuv rechitza is tzvei mol atog. That's what he wants us to know. What's unique about entering Ohel Moed is the requirement to wash hands and feet applies only twice a day. The 2 times a day where the Kohanim go in to do all the various things that have to be done in Ohel Moed, which is Lakter Shachris of at the times where the Keteris is brought in the morning and afternoon. But I'm poshet. It's a very simple reason. When a Kohen finishes all of the duties of what had to be taken care of in Ohel Moed in the morning, the Torah is going to speak pragmatically. What happens next? He goes out. So logically, when the Kohen has to come back on duty in the afternoon to do the next set of avodas, he's been away from the Ohel Moed for a period of time, and now it's at Zweite Kenisa to leave the avodah from Ben Arbaim. He's now re-entering afresh to the Ohel Moed for a new set of avodah. And especially if you remember, we mentioned you're not allowed to just dawdle in the Ohel Moed. When you finish what you've had to do over there, you get out. So now logically there's one group of avodas in the morning, so that's one time you enter, so you're going to enter, wash your hands and feet. There's another independent group of avodas in the afternoon with a gap in between where you've left the Ohel Moed because you're not allowed to hang around, so now you're coming back, wash your hands and feet. So the time, was sagt Rashi, und kleibt is dogma von Keteris, then you'd say, but there are many things that you do in the morning and many things you do in the afternoon. Why did Rashi specify dafka Keteris? Because Rashi's approach is that the very first thing Kohanim did in the Ohel Moed on a daily basis was they brought the Keteris. So that must have been the first time they entered Ohel Moed and the first time they were required to wash hands and feet. We'll analyze this from a more specific halachic perspective shortly. So now, in Rashi's view, the first thing you're going to do in the morning is Keteris. So now you've washed your hands and feet in order to do the Keteris. You don't have to wash your hands and feet for any of the other things that you're going to do, be it preparing the menorah, or the lechem aponim if it's that particular day, etc. Because the Torah only requires washing hands and feet when you enter Ohel Moed, and you've entered. Of course, if another Kohen had to now enter the Ohel Moed to do a different avodah, obviously he'd have to wash. Because now he is entering Ohel Moed, and that's the definition. When you enter Ohel Moed, that's when you wash. But Rashi will bringen dem Chiddush from Pasuk. Rashi wants to illustrate to us what the Torah is telling us that we wouldn't have thought of or realized. As the Chiyuv Chitza is oif dem bevoyam. The Chiddush of the Pasuk is that you wash hands and feet for the Ohel Moed when you enter unit oif dem l'sharis, as opposed to when you do an avodah. Therefore, after the Kohen washes his hands on entrance into the Ohel Moed, as mentioned, he doesn't have to wash again for any of the other things that he does in the Ohel Moed. So now we've only really addressed the fact that he says Keteris in the morning. Why does Rashi also say Keteris in the afternoon? So it turns out Lakter Shachris Ben Arboim as mit Lakter Shachris or Ben Arboim Keteris, by saying that the two major time frames are when you bring Keteris in the morning and Keteris in the afternoon, is Rashi nit madgish as der Chitz is verbunden non mit avodas Keteris. Rashi is not trying to tell us that it's because you're doing Keteris, therefore you have to wash your hands and feet, because that would imply that you have to wash your hands and feet in order to do avodah. Now, I made to anweisen der bestimmten Zmane von bevoyim Ohel Moed. Rather, Rashi is trying to show us the time frames, because Rashi is explaining that the Torah wants us to know you wash hands and feet on entry into the Ohel Moed. When is entry? When it's Keteris in the morning and Keteris in the afternoon. Both on Kavua, Rashi says, on a regular basis, the Kohanim only entered the Ohel Moed twice a day, in the morning and in the afternoon, both tied to Keteris. And now you can also understand why Rashi adds these other far less frequent examples of the bull brought by the Kohen Mashiach, or the goats brought for Avodah Zarah. He has to mention them because they don't fit into the daily service where only twice a day you enter the Ohel Moed, and therefore only twice a day you have to wash hands and feet. Das heißt, in other words, Rashi is basically telling us there are two possible ways Kohanim would ever enter the Ohel Moed. One is there is the regular process of entering Ohel Moed, which happens daily. You come in the morning and do the Keteris and everything else that goes with it, and in the afternoon and everything else that goes with it. So that's the most regular access to the Ohel Moed. And when the Bevoyam is then he says there's an alternative, which is that you enter the Ohel Moed for a very unique, specific project, which doesn't happen on a regular basis, and that's represented by Bevoyam Gomer Hazaz Midam Parkei. Now, Mashiach Osir Avodah Zarah by the two examples that Rashi gives us. What's Rashi's point? The point is, unlike the Mizbeach, where you have to make sure you have clean hands and feet before you do any avodah, even if it's one after the next, in the Ohel Moed, you just have to wash your hands and feet before you enter, even if you're going to do multiple things. Now, this is going to tell us something fascinating about Rashi's view halachically, and you'll see how it's different to the Rambam's view about one of the things that happen inside the Ohel Moed. Let's see a fascinating insight from an halachic perspective based on what Rashi has just said. When it comes to Aaron's responsibility to do the avodah associated with the menorah, when the pasuk describes what Aaron had to do at the end of Parshas Tetzaveh, it uses tzvei lashonos, two expressions. One is, it tells us that he has to do an avodah with the menorah in the morning, and there, when it describes what he does in the early evening, late afternoon, it says, what's the difference? Is a dodi plukta zwischen Rashi mit Rambam in the Pirush von Hatovas Haneros. Everybody agrees Bahalos Haneros means light the menorah. Behetivoyas Haneros, that's a debate between the Rambam and Rashi. The Rambam learned as Adlokas Haneros hi hatovosam. According to the Rambam, Hatava does, yes, include setting up and cleaning the menorah, but the objective is to light the menorah, and therefore, therefore the Rambam is of the view that the Kohen lit the menorah twice a day, both in the morning and the evening. Rashi is Rashi, on the other hand, of course, is pshat, therefore he's going to take a more pshat translation of the word behetivo. He says it means l'shoin nikuya b'zichon shel menorah. That means to clean out all the tools that are used to hold the oil of the menorah. Medashan apsilos shenisr for belayda, take out the old wicks that had burned through the night. Un l'shitosoy is adlakas hamenorah given ein malatog ben harboim. And Rashi holds that the morning avodah was to clean and prepare the menorah, and the evening avodah was to light the menorah. You only lit it once a day. But Pizeh is moving as Rashi gate with that in mind, Rashi here sticks with his personal view, which is Derech Pshat leitzich as the ikra avodah in the menorah is adlokas haneros. I think everybody would agree that according to Pshat, the menorah is there to be lit. So the primary avodah you do with the menorah is you light the menorah. Cleaning and preparing the wicks must qualify only as preparation for the lighting of the menorah, which is the primary responsibility. You've got to prepare the lamps so that they're ready to be lit. You can actually see this clearly in the various psukim that describe the menorah. You'll see something quite glaring. As the idea of elevating the lamps, which basically means lighting the menorah, is repeated multiple times in the Torah. But the concept of atova, which Rashi calls cleaning and preparing the menorah, verdemont is only mentioned out of blois ein mol, only once. And that one time is not even in a conversation around the menorah. No, but derech agav in the parasha for Mizbeach HaKetoros. But it's like a sidebar in a different conversation around preparing the Mizbeach HaKetoros. So on zeichnen das man von aktoras haketoros baboiker, and it's used as a time frame to let us know when it is that you bring ketoros in the morning. Behetivo yasaneros, at the same time that you're preparing and cleaning the menorah, yakterena, that's when you bring ketoros. Now, seeing as Rashi believes that behetivo means only cleaning and preparing and not lighting the menorah, that's why Rashi here in our commentary says As the bevoyam el Oyel Moed is given lahaktir chulei. That the first time they would enter the Oyel Moed in the morning was for what purpose? To bring Keteris. Because Rashi tells us that what's the first and primary thing you do every single morning in the Oyel Moed is you bring Keteris. That's why the Kohen goes into the Oyel Moed in the morning, to make the Keteris. You can't say that the primary focus of the Kohen's Avodah in Oyel Moed in the morning is Heitivos Aneros, because that's was is Nikyan Avodah Fasich. That's not an Avodah. No, it's preparation for lighting the menorah much later on. So that's why Rashi is absolutely clear that if you want an example of the main purpose to enter the Oyel Moed in the morning, and that's going to become the time slot that we use to say when you have to wash your hands and feet before you go into the Oyel Moed, must be that you're going in to bring Keteris, because to go in to prepare the menorah is not an avodah, it is a preparation for a later avodah. And as we've mentioned, Rashi does not want us to think that the Torah is requiring washing of the hands and feet so that you could bring Keteris. But really, all the Torah wants to tell us is when you enter the Oyel Moed, and we know that you have to wash hands and feet in order to enter. Rashi has to tell us when is the time that they went in the morning. The time they would have to bring Keteris vos dos is der avodah kanal, because as we've clearly explained, Keteris is the first avodah. Therefore, it's the first entry into the mishka, into the Oyel Moed. Therefore, it's the first time you have to wash hands and feet. Now, once Rashi has used the Keteris as the one bookend to illustrate the first avodah that you do in the Oyel Moed, and therefore the first time you have to wash hands and feet, he uses the same example of the Keteris at the end of the day. Because one thing we know for sure from all the psukim is that the timing of bringing Keteris coincides with the timing of lighting the menorah. As the pasuk says, when you light the menorah, that's when you bring Keteris. So therefore, Rashi is quite comfortable to say the first time you go into the Oyel Moed is to bring Keteris, and the last time, or the second time that you go into the Oyel Moed is also to bring Keteris, which coincides also with the time that you're lighting the menorah. And we'll explain why he focuses on the Keteris rather than the menorah. The fact that Rashi says that you enter the Oyel Moed in the morning for Keteris and in the afternoon for Keteris is Varashan Nemton, because Rashi's view is as the Pirush from the Psukim Beitivas Aneres Yaktirena, or Vahalas Aneres Ben Arboim Yaktirena, the two different Psukim that say when you're cleaning the menorah, that's when you bring the Keteris. When you're lighting the menorah in the afternoon, that's when you bring the Keteris. It's not, Rashi says, because first you prepare the menorah, then you bring Keteris. First you light the menorah, then you bring Keteris. Now, as the Yachteren darf getan werden in dem Zman fun Hatova v'Hadlaka, rather the Torah is telling us the time frame within which you bring Keteris must be within the same time frame that you're preparing or lighting the menorah. Aber die Haktorah kommt früher und sie ist die erste Avodah, sei bei Boker und sei bei Arboim. Rashi's unique perspective is that actually Keteris precedes cleaning the menorah, and in the afternoon precedes lighting the menorah. So both in the morning and in the afternoon, Keteris is the first Avodah you do. Therefore, seeing as the halacha is you have to wash hands and feet before you enter the Oyel Moed. And why do you enter the Oyel Moed? For Avodah. And which is the first Avodah? Keteris. Therefore, what does Rashi say is the time where you wash hands and feet before going into the Oyel Moed? Before Keteris in the morning and in the afternoon. And we can prove it. Baldas Hatovas Haneris is blois, as we've mentioned. Hatovas Haneris means aleph only, a'inu for nikoya, just means cleaning. And base secondly, was is blois achona ve'hechshet to that lokasha ben arboim, and is therefore only a preamble, a precursor to the avodah. So we have to accept then. Obviously, you first do the main avodah. Haktoras HaKeteris, bringing the Keteris. And only after you've done what is real avodah, the Keteris, then you have the luxury of doing something which is prep for another avodah, preparing the menorah. Now, that's Beit Tivoi, right? That's the pasuk that says Beit Tivoi Saneris Yaktirena. When you prepare the menorah, you bring the keteris, and we understand that it means you first bring the keteris because you prioritize avoida over preparation for avoida. Straight after that, was steht gleich nach dem, the next pasuk says Saneris Ben Arboim Yaktirena. Logic says that also implies first you bring the keteris and then you do the menorah, because it's the same kind of language as the immediately preceding pasuk, which is clear that keteris comes first. Therefore, the first thing you do when you come into Oyel Moed in the morning is keteris. The first thing you do when you come into Oyel Moed in the afternoon is keteris. Those are the two indicators that Rashi uses to tell us what avodah is in the Oyel Moed on a regular basis. And you have to wash hands and feet before you enter the Oyel Moed. So now Rashi's commentary makes sense. And it has a powerful spiritual lesson for us. For Yena Shalteira Shebepirish Rashi. Rechitzes Yadayim Raglayim is in Yonah. The concept of washing hands and feet means before a Jewish person begins their service of Hashem, their holy service of Hashem, the Jew first has to wash away any negativity. Just like you clean your hands, you've got to clean away the shmutz, spiritual shmutz. So the Torah immediately identifies the different ways that you have to wash up before serving in the outer mizbech or inside the Ohel Moed. Which would be represented by the keteris, which is brought on the inner golden mizbech. To understand that, what is the difference between the outer copper mizbech and the inner golden mizbech in spiritual terms? The chilek zwischen Mizbech HaChitzon and Mizbech HaPnimi is, the distinction is Mizbech HaChitzon is tzili b'avodas hakarbonos. Outside, you took animals and you sacrificed them on that Mizbech. Was das dienen von birurim? That represents the entire spiritual discipline of elevating the physical world to become holy. You take an animal, which is very much part of the physical world, and you put that animal into a context of holiness and burn it up in a fire of dedication to Hashem, it becomes elevated to become holy. Whereas the golden mizbech indoors, you are not allowed to bring an animal sacrifice on that mizbech. It's designated only for keteris vosinyona is nit birurim. Keteris does not represent working with, refining and elevating the world, nor hiskashus. Rather, it represents forging a deep, meaningful bond with Hashem. Keteris comes from the lashon bechad ketira iskatarna, like Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai said. I'm bound up with Hashem with a single knot. Keteris kesher. It's the same kind of word. In other words, the inner mizbech, the golden mizbech, represents deepening our personal connection to Hashem. So these two altars speak to two different stages of our spiritual development. When we're talking about the altar which is outdoors, which is reserved for animals to try and transform them, that refers to a more superficial element of our emotional bond with our Yiddishkeit. And because it's a little bit more external, it allows us to engage the world, and it gives us the opportunity and the responsibility to transform the world and make it holy. Whereas the inner golden altar, that represents the depth of our connection to Hashem, or the depth of our emotion, which is totally beyond getting its hands dirty in the world, because mitzad pnimius halev is the avodah zu verbinden sich tiefer mit Neibishn. That's the part of us that wants to connect us to Hashem. So in other words, there's an element of who we are that understands and appreciates the value of going out into the world and making the world a vessel for godliness. And there's a part of us that is like the truest sense of who we are, which is we just want to be connected to Hashem. On the river. So therefore, when a person is at that stage or in that mode of behavior which is associated with the more outer dimensions of the heart, where we still relate to the physicality and the reality of this world, and if you relate to the world of it, then there is susceptibility to negative things that could happen. Therefore, we have to be really careful. So if I'm living in a spiritual reality where the world is still real, and that's why I'm engaging the world and trying to transform it, I also have to know the world is real, and therefore it brings a certain amount of danger. So every time I step out into the world, first wash hands and feet. First get rid of the schmutz, get rid of anything that's untoward, so that I can go with the right attitude and have a healthy, powerful impact. Aber when a person is at a higher dimension of service of Hashem, which is you working internally on this deep, meaningful connection to Hashem, at that point the person is completely removed from the physicality of this world. So that person can just do one wash off of all the schmutz once per avoida, and it works. Not thereby, but there's a warning label, which is occasionally there are other kinds of avoida that you have to do. Even inside that Ohel Moed higher reality, then you have to wash your hands again. What does that mean? If we're dealing with a keteris, what that represents is a person's bond with Hashem is genug de einzige rechitza. So if you're at that level that you're working on deepening your bond, one dose of cleansing away the negative is enough. But if a person has to do kapara, because that's what it is, avodah zara, they're bringing the blood of a chatos that was to atone for avodah zara. Now we're dealing with stuff that went wrong. Oh, you're going to step into the world of things that went wrong. You need another personal cleanse. Yes, you are somebody who's at the keteris level, which means you are somebody who is pretty much distant, aloof from the world. And for a Rabbi Frat, you certainly are very distant from anything negative. But if you have to take on the removal of something negative, it doesn't have to be negative from yourself, it could be negative from the society. Then you've got to be so careful that you are protected, that it doesn't suck you down. That's why Rashi tells us, if now you're going into the world of these places of bilti rotzai, of something which is negative that you're trying to correct, make sure to wash your hands and feet again. Because if you do this right, you'll bring more peace to the world. Because if it's Yerida Gedola Yoser, if you're tackling something which is very off the tracks, Tikkun Aliyah Gedola Yoser, the result of how you fix and elevate and transform it will produce a much higher elevation. And when you look at the nature, just if you look at how Sirei Avodah Zarah work, they have to be accompanied by and they have to follow a korban oila. That means moisef of the oila. It gives us the opportunity to elevate even higher. In other words, the lesson for us is that there's a big portion of our lives engaged with the world out there, the Avodah Sabirurim, and we have to know that every single time we engage with the world, we have to re-energize ourselves and get rid of anything that could be distracted. If we're fortunate enough to be at the level of Keteris, this tremendous connection to Hashem, we need less of that work. But then, and we all have this responsibility at times, when we have to engage with things that are outside of our personal lives, but are nonetheless not so healthy, when we engage with those things, we again need to do this introspection, make sure we're not coming from any inappropriate perspective or approach, and only that way can we succeed.